Ken Hafertepe. He specializes in decorative arts, in material culture, historic preservation, architecture, and he is currently the chair of the Museum Studies Department at Baylor, where he's been since the year 2000. He has got several publications. Here are just a few: A History of Ashton Villa in Galveston, and A History of Abner Cook, Master Builder on the Texas Frontier. Most recently, hot off the presses, is an article that today's talk is based on about wandering in Texas cemeteries. So we have a few copies of these at the end if you might be interested. So with that, I will give you Ken Hafertepe and a wander through a Texas cemetery.
Thank you, Leanna. Good to see you all here. All right. Well, yes, as Leanna was mentioning, that when the Texas State Historical Association was here in Fort Worth, over at the Renaissance Hotel, about 2 blocks from here, there was a session, there always is, of young Texas historians, college-age students who've done publication-worthy research. And they always ask a senior Texas history scholar to do a presentation as well. And I guess I've acquired enough gray hairs over the year that I now qualify for senior historian status, if sheerly in terms of gray hairs, rather than anything else. But the talk that I did for that was Wanderings in Texas Cemeteries and what we might learn from them. And Texas cemeteries are something that I've been wandering through and wondering about for a very long time now. When I teach American material culture, which is really what can stuff tell us about history and sort of the big historical picture, we always take a field trip to Oakwood. Not the Oakwood here in Fort Worth, but the Oakwood in Waco is a pretty popular name for cemeteries. In fact, there's one in Austin as well. And a lot of cemeteries have either oak in the name or wood, or it seems to be an association with evergreen trees and the idea of eternal life, which is one of those interesting things that addresses the issues of the way in which cemeteries are about people mourning the loss of a loved one, but also thinking about issues of eternal life. And when I teach gravestones and graveyards in material culture, we always use the classic book on the subject, which is Terry G. Jordan's Texas Graveyards. Anybody seen that one? It's getting to be an oldie moldy now. And in fact, I'm getting a little bit impatient with it. In the next year or so, I'm going to publish a book on the material culture of German Texans, which is going to have a very long chapter about cemeteries in Fredericksburg and New Braunfels, but also in Round Top and Frelsburg, and even Germans making gravestones in San Antonio and Houston and the like. We'll see little foretastes of that this morning. Well, we're just going to give you the very quickest overview of Terry Jordan's 4 noteworthy truths about Texas graveyards. They are a form of necrogeography. They are about the living and the dead. They reflect conservatism and they reflect change. Okay, so those are Terry Jordan's 4 big truths. Necrogeography sounds like a pretty fancy concept, but basically it's saying, and Terry Jordan was a cultural geographer at University of North Texas for a very long time. Actually, he was at North Texas State, but that's another story. And then later at the University of Texas. And so he was interested in human behavior, human settlement, and the way that the remains that humans leave on the landscape are in fact telling us something about the culture that they came from. For example, an excellent example of burial practices varying by region and by ethnic groups that settle in a particular region is the use of dry rock walls to bound cemeteries. This is in Round Top, Texas, right by the Bethlehem Lutheran Church, one of the oldest and most historic churches in Texas, 1866. And just the way that these walls are constructed are speaking to certain German attitudes and You'll find these in other German cemeteries, like the Moisebach Cemetery out in Cherry Spring near Fredericksburg. But you're not going to find those in, a Norwegian cemetery or a Mexican cemetery or an Anglo cemetery. So necrogeography is saying that the way people behave and create spaces that are about burial tell you something about the ethnic group that they came from. This is especially true in earlier years, and one of the things that I'm trying to do with Germans is to take the story from early Germanic ideas, or ideas that Germans adopted in Texas, in this case, and following the story through and watching Germans assimilate rather slowly into the American mainstream. So that's something that I'm very interested in. So necrogeography. Cemeteries are about the living and the dead. This rather, I don't know if it's a heroic or a desperate statement that memory is possession, carved, at great expense I might add, into a granite stone in the cemetery in Bastrop. And this was for the Organ family. Frank Organ was the son, and his parents were Ed and Sarah Jane Organ. And this seems to be one of those cases where the monument is perhaps even more for the living, because it's Ed and Sarah Jane working out their grieving towards the early death of their son. And so that to remember their son is to still somehow possess him even though he's gone. And much more typical are phrasings like gone but not forgotten. You can see that in just about any cemetery in Texas. And I guess this is sort of the individualistic school teacher, Sarah Jane, wanting to state that in a slightly more emphatic way. So cemeteries are definitely for burying the dead, but they're also for the mourning that we do for the dead and the memorialization of the dead. And cemeteries are about conservatism, and that's sort of speaking to the very traditional aspects, especially of early cemeteries and handmade gravestones, and that sometimes the symbolism in here is incredibly ancient, sometimes even predating Christianity, although here we have a dove bringing an olive branch, which seems to be alluding to Genesis and the story of Noah and the great flood. This one is actually just a couple of miles from here. This is over in the Lonesome Dove Cemetery in Grapevine. We'll talk about that more in just a minute, but a very cool gravestone. I keep pointing towards the screen, but I'm supposed to be pointing back there. I'll remember that. And then finally, what you observe looking at Texas cemeteries is that cemeteries are about change. Change happens, it has happened, it is happening right now, and it will be happening in the future. It's really sort of like the story, I guess it's apocryphal, of Adam turning to Eve when they're departing from the Garden of Eden. And he says to her, "My dear, we live in a time of transition." And that was the first big transition out of paradise into our flawed world. And those transitions have just kept rolling. So in this is actually the Moisebach family cemetery at Cherry Spring. John O. Moisebach, the leader of German immigration into Fredericksburg. But another dry rock wall there. I don't know what that is. I think it might be art, but don't quote me on that. The interesting thing is, it's this very traditional family cemetery kind of plot, but this is also about change, because even John R. Moisebach, who comes to Texas in 1846 and leads the settlers out to Fredericksburg and gets the books in order because it was a complete mess, he's resting under an extremely modern gray granite stone that is only possible through the use of industrial techniques, steam saws basically with diamonds in the saw blades, so that this is not physically, it's not possible at all in 1846 or 1856 or 1866. This is something that can only happen starting in the late 1880s. So that we look at this and we say, oh, they're timeless, these Texas cemeteries. Well, not really. they're changing along with we're changing, but they were living in a world of transition as well. Questions about any of that? Are we pretty okay on all of this? Okay, so those are our noteworthy truths. Well, what is there left to say? Terry Jordan was so brilliant, and he covered the whole territory, didn't he? Well, yes and no. And one of the things that interests me and was not in sort of the Terry Jordan view of cemeteries was looking at cemeteries in terms of who's producing the gravestones. And in fact, the method that Terry Jordan uses is one that really is dependent on it being a folk culture rather than a modern commercial or professionalized culture. And so as a result, if you saw the signature of a gravestone carver on a stone, it was like, I didn't see that. This is a folk production, so I can talk about it. And as a result, you get some pretty weird things happening, and we'll talk a little more about that. But the thing that interests me, and that I think helps deepen our understanding of gravestones and graveyards, is to think about the emergence of a profession. And they were sometimes called monument men, not to be confused with the George Clooney movie, or sometimes called marble men. And their shops would be called marble yards or marble works or monument works. There are a variety of names. And you can actually see works by these professional gravestone carvers in cemeteries all over Texas. And so I've started kind of collecting them. And so the change that's happening has to do with family plots like this. And in fact, the interesting thing is here that this is a fairly traditional sort of obelisk marker here, pretty characteristic. You can just go over to Oakwood and find, have a dozen of those at least. But the way it's bounded in that cast iron fence is a new process that only happens after the Civil War. It's the same cast iron foundries that are producing the cresting for Victorian mansions up on the top of their roof and producing, gates and fences for housing and the like. So we'll actually talk about that in just a little bit. And the marble yards tended to think about the whole space, not just the monument itself, but how do people bound out the space that's for their family alone. And so this is one of the things that's happening here. Another thing that's happening is the creation of actual businesses. And this is a marble yard, and this is from the Fort Worth City Directory, 1888-89, which is pretty cool. This is, as I don't have to tell you this because you can read, this is John A. Bergen and Son, who were the first professional monument makers here in Fort Worth. And we'll talk a little bit more about them later. But what's happening in the Victorian era is also the beginnings of a specific relationship between a craftsman here, and here is obviously a bereaved wife, and I don't know if that's her brother or whatever, but so this is the relationship between craftsman and customer that's happening, and it's kind of interesting because our guy is wearing this what would you call that, an apron or something for covering, so that obviously like Paul Revere in the famous Copley painting, he's presenting himself as a craftsman, but also to a certain extent as an artist. But this is a different relationship than you would have seen in the earliest Texas cemeteries. So we'll talk about that as well. Questions about any of this so far? Are we pretty okay? Well, we're going to sort of do backstory for just a bit, because we're talking, when you talk about the production of marble men and marble yards, we're talking about a pretty high style kind of product, but as Jordan pointed out in his book on Texas graveyards, there are many characteristics of a Southern folk cemetery. And one of the interesting things that Jordan points out is that it's very hard to separate out attitudes that are coming from the Anglo-Southern tradition and attitudes that are coming out of the African-American tradition, that those two groups lived so closely, side by side, one group in chains, for so long that they influenced each other in thinking about the proper way of burying a family member. And so things like scraped lots, which are pretty rapidly disappearing, as you know, we tend to think of cemeteries as sort of manicured, beautiful lawns and pretty bushes and the like, a place of peace and beauty. There was a different attitude, and this is a very rural, it still is a rural cemetery in Limestone County to the east of Waco. It's the LaSalle Cemetery. You can see that it's pretty much, well, it needs a little tender loving care here, but it's actually bounded, a family lot, not by a fence, but by a concrete curb. And curbing is something that's characteristic in a lot of early Texas cemeteries. Germans especially loved curbing, but we'll talk about that later. But scraping is something that is significant in Anglo-Southern and African-American cemeteries at the time. And Jordan wondered why and never really came up with like a compelling answer of why. Some informants, which is to say very old people when he was working on this book in the late 60s and early 70s, you know, would sort of give him their best guess. And you know, some thought, well, I was always told that it was a sign of respect for your ancestors that you weren't going to let a weed or anything grow over their grave. Like, well, maybe that made sense to them, but I still don't really get that. But scraped graves are something that was a distinct feature of the earliest Texas cemeteries, especially in rural areas. Here's another view. The camera is just sort of rotating and looking sort of southeast here. It's interesting as well because you can see that there are actually unmarked stones that are marking burials. That's interesting, and we tend to think of that, well, what's the point? You know, why do you put a stone? You know, Horatio Greenough, the 19th century sculptor, said of the Washington Monument, it says, it's a monument that says one word, here. And, you know, then you have to sort of fill in the rest by yourself or read your guidebook or whatever. And this is the most basic sort of marker. There is someone buried here. But a lot of the earliest markers, if they weren't unmarked stone, might be of wood. And those are actually not the most weather resistant kind of things. And in fact, a lot of early stone markers may actually be a second marker for the person who's buried there. That you might have a marker that lasts for 20 years, and then you either have, if your family's still there and your family's still doing well economically, you can put a nice permanent marker. But there are a lot of burials, not only in Texas, but everywhere where the markers have disappeared, and so there is a pretty large percentage of unmarked burials. That's true, and I've seen some statistics for Round Top, that there's something like, for every 2 gravestones, there's another body that's there unmarked, and that's just the way things happen over time. But scraping, here's another way. If you have more than one rock or more than one slab, you're just not going to put it upright in the ground. You can do this as sort of covering. It almost looks like they just laid the body flat on the ground and started covering it. I hope that's not true, but sometimes the modern notion of 6 feet under, which we just sort of naturally think about that. That's really a product of the late 19th century and better digging machines and the like, that in the colonial era, I used to work in western Massachusetts, a historic deer field. It might be 3 feet, 4 feet. It was sort of, whenever they got tired of digging, and okay, let's put the body in. But it becomes standardized with the creation of, it's in association with the marble yards, but also funeral homes or funeral parlors, as they were called at early dates. And so that kind of gets things regularized. This is just a beautiful image from another Limestone County rural cemetery, the Old Bethel Cemetery. And there's some with all information about name birth and death date. But others are just these sort of stones set in this beautiful field, which has a sort of beauty and poignance to it as well. But it is possible to have Southern folk graves with handmade decoration. And this is the stone of Little M.C. Sanders. There's Little M.C., son of, and it's basically the initials of his parents, and then there's Sanders down there. And this is at the Fort Parker Memorial Park, which is in Falls County, just to the southeast of Waco. But a simple sandstone marker, you can see that the person who carved it was able to create a pediment, so that there's a simple allusion to the classical style. And this was at an age when, the Greek Revival style of Abner Cook in Austin and other builders in Texas had made classical style very familiar to Texans, even if they couldn't really afford high-style Greek Revival themselves. So that there's an attempt here to provide a certain level of stylishness to this little boy's grave. Another feature of the Southern Folk Cemetery that it's interesting when you can find these, they're getting kind of rare, is tabernacles. This is actually a very well-maintained tabernacle at the far northern tip of McLennan County, where Waco is, pretty near west, actually. And it's in the White Rock Cemetery. And the point that Jordan makes is that there's in many cemeteries there's a lack of sanctity. Part of that is coming out of the Protestant tradition and Calvinism, that the belief was that, and that it's in reaction to the Catholic Church, there was a reaction against prayers that were going to help the person get to heaven after they'd been buried and the like. And the Calvinist and Puritan reaction against that was quite strong, to where funerals did not proceed from churches. They were from the home. The body was laid out in the parlor and went to the cemetery from the home. And even saying prayers at the cemetery were verboten, because that would make it seem like you were trying to convince God to let the person into heaven. And that was a bad thing. It was frankly, as they would put it, way too Catholic to do something like that. In the Puritan ideology, if you weren't able to achieve salvation through your life, the prayers of your friends just weren't going to help you at all. And so to the degree that the Southern Folk Cemetery is a Protestant cemetery, there is kind of this reticence about, in a lot of these folk cemeteries, you see very few crosses. That was perceived as being Catholic, or Papist, as it was sometimes called. And so you see a lot more crosses in Catholic cemeteries than you do in city cemeteries, which is for all the non-Catholics, I guess you could say. But the tabernacles are sort of pseudo-sanctified, in the sense that it looks like there are benches, it looks like you could have a little memorial service there or something like that, which is fine and good. But one of the other things that Jordan points out is that tabernacles were useful when people would come to decorate the cemetery, and that there was a long-standing tradition in Texas and elsewhere of going at least once a year, or maybe once in fall and once in spring, to clean up the cemetery and make sure that your ancestors' graves looked all nice, maybe put fresh flowers out, and that the tabernacle could actually be a nice place to sit and visit with your friends and family that you haven't seen since the last time you cleared up the cemetery. And so it has a non-sanctified function as well. This is a very beautiful and tidy little one with a fancy hipped roof. It's sloping down on all sides here. But there are also rural versions that are extremely cool in their own right. And it's like, oh my God. And this one is leaning a little more in the direction of sanctification, believe it or not. When you look at it, it's so rural, it's so woodsy, and yet it's got all those pews in there. So you can actually find these in association with rural churches sometime, which is saying something about the trajectory of Protestantism over the course of the 19th century, that there's kind of a merging back towards the middle in religious attitudes, that it wasn't as Catholic on one side, Protestant on the other. But There's one in Byrnes, which is on the back road between Waco and Waxahachie, where there's a beautiful little sanctuary that actually has a pulpit. So, when you get to the point where you have a pulpit, it's pretty seriously, religious and pretty seriously sanctified. But there's sort of this ambivalence about the sanctity of the cemetery. And for Catholics, the cemetery has to be blessed ground. And that's why they're separate, because only Catholics can be buried in the blessed ground. And so, because Protestants believed that it wasn't holy ground, that it was your final resting place, but pretty much that's it, and hopefully you're off in heaven. But because it wasn't sanctified, it was fine to have Jews or buried there, or even atheists or the like, so that there's more of an openness to city cemeteries that were, even though they were predominantly Protestant. And just a quick word about African influence on Southern burial practices. You can still find in rural cemeteries in Texas, and actually I've seen them in Oklahoma as well, and I wouldn't be surprised if rural areas of the South, of graves that are decorated in the ways that are very similar to the way that Africans would decorate the graves of distinguished people. This is an 1891 image of a Congo chieftain's grave at the top, which actually this photo at the bottom is not in Jordan, but it's in John Michael Vlach's book on African American decorative arts. And it's a photo from the Sea Islands in South Carolina, and shows a very similar sort of assemblage of stuff. Some of it, and it's interesting because it's in conjunction with it's kind of traditional, white marble gravestone with all the data in there. But you've got all of these pots and flower jars, and you've got a clock that's stopped, and that's one of the images of the hands of the clock stop, and that marks the time of death, and all of that sort of thing. I don't know if that's actually a clock that was in the room or anything like that, but that's part of the metaphor of the death process and the ending of time for that person on this earth. So you find these in historic black graveyards, but you can also find them in Anglo-Southern graveyards. And this is one of those blending sort of things. It gets even more complicated when you look at something like this in Huntsville. This is a historic photograph of Sam Houston's burial ground in Huntsville. And it had your standard, pretty nice white marble monument, which is what you're seeing right here. But the picket fence that's surrounding it, very nicely done with these carvings, were made by Joshua Houston, who had been the senior slave in the Houston household. And in fact, it's an interesting story, and he was freed by the Houstons at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation, even though the war was still going on. But he made this fence for his former master to honor him. It's really quite remarkable to see the sort of African-American production. It's just a very complicated story. The sad part is that in 1936, which we all know was when Texas had its centennial celebration, and all sorts of good things were done, and new museums were created, and Fair Park was elaborated. But another thing that happened in the context of that was upgrading Sam's cemetery. And so it ends up being this, carved by Pompeo Coffini, the Italian-American sculptor. And part of that too is this very fancy cast iron fence with gold tips. And so Joshua's work and the original gravestone sort of got wiped away in 1936. The gravestone, I will add, is still in the Sam Houston Memorial Museum, which was one of the museums created or amplified in 1936. But it got a little bombastic. This is not a Southern folk marker anymore. What can I say? But in addition to folk markers in the Anglo tradition and the Southern folk tradition, there are other types of markers as well. This is one that is in Jordan's Texas graveyards pretty early on, and it's a monument to Anders Arnesen Bretta, who was Norwegian. And there was a pretty fair amount of Norwegian settlement, first east of Dallas, and they decided they weren't that wild about that, so a lot of them moved to Bosque County, northwest of Waco. And you can see that on this image, there's a lot of sort of standard issue, sent from a big city, gray granite markers. But this is the oldest marker in the cemetery. And in fact, 1854 was when Norwegians were coming out. I was talking with the curator of the Bosque Memorial Museum, and he said that Anders Arnesen Bretta came out, was one of the first settlers to come out and to sort of help organize the place, and that he died in a hunting accident. And so that's why they had to bury him almost immediately after he got to Bosque County. Or this is a mixture because it's about something that was popular in southern, but this is actually an Alsatian burial out in Quihee, which is near Castroville, which is west of San Antonio. And it is a surviving wooden marker, and these are so rare to still be in the wild. And it's kind of hard to see, but there's a D right there, and I think it might be D. Herman. This is kind of a midday photograph that I took, and the reason that you can see the lettering there is that when it was originally made, they painted the information on to the board, and that prevented the wood underneath those letters from weathering. And because it wasn't weathering, as long as the paint stayed on, all the wood around it was sort of slowly weathering, and so it wasn't until the paint fell off or was not being renewed anymore by family members or however that worked, but you still have these ghostly letters on it, which is really quite remarkable. So, and this is in the Lutheran cemetery at Quihee. And part of this sort of gets back to the point I was making about Jordan. This is over at Lonesome Dove Cemetery, just outside of Grapevine. It's not that there's a place called Lonesome Dove, except in Larry McMurtry's imagination, but there was a Lonesome Dove Cemetery which was associated with Lonesome Dove Baptist Church. You guys have heard the story about Larry McMurtry was driving around in Fort Worth, and he noticed a van, and it said Lonesome Dove Baptist Church on the side of it. And he said, wow, that would make a good title for a novel. And the rest, of course, we know is history. And so this is one of the oldest stones in the Lonesome Dove Cemetery, and from 1870, and it's for Malinda Hill. And it's really quite remarkable. Unfortunately, do you notice that there are iron rods here and here? That's basically keeping the upper part and the lower part together. And there is a pretty fair amount of vandalism that happens in historic cemeteries. In fact, that happened in Waco within the last year. I know that it's happened here as well, and that's really a shame. And the stone early markers tend to be the most vulnerable. It's really hard to deface those gray granite or red granite stones. They are tough. That's why they weren't used by the early carvers, because it was so difficult. But it's a lot easier to vandalize these stones, and also acid rain and other environmental degradation from even from the car that I used to drive up from Waco this morning is contributing to it. That's one of the things that happens, is it leads to, increases the deterioration of the stones. But Terry Jordan feels that he has to be analyzing things that are folk, that when you move away from folk, when it's compromised by the modern world rushing in, or compromised by, urban gravestone makers, you're getting away from the true understanding that a folk expression can make. It certainly changes the rules of the game, but I think that we oftentimes express some identity about ourselves or about our deceased loved ones by what we buy them or what we commission for them. So that I understand what he's saying about folk expressions, but I think there's historical significance in markers that are professionally made, as well as those that were homemade. And the interesting thing, two quick things about this. We have a religious symbol here, a kind of an idiosyncratic version of a common one. It's a hand that's over a book, which we may presume is the Bible, that this is part of the speaking of her faithfulness. Even more interesting is down here there's what looks to be a building. It's a little cryptic. I don't think it looks like any Texas church, to tell you the truth. But I have a feeling that that this is an attempt to create a heavenly mansion, and that there's a hope here. And it may be, in fact, that this was carved by one of Melinda Hill's sons who worked out in the area northwest of Fort Worth. It may be a folk expression of that she has gone to her father's heavenly house, which is another thing that would drive Puritans crazy. It was like, no, that's the sin of presumption, as a Puritan would say. But we won't get too theological here. Then here's the flip side, which we already saw, which has the dove bringing back the leaf, which is pretty cool stuff. Okay, well, we're going to shift to talk about some of the stones that we see in cemeteries more commonly, and which are created for quite a while by these guys who are called monument men, and they're still the successors to them who are working today in producing monuments or importing them from other parts of the U.S. or even from overseas. This is an interesting one. This is the original Alamo Monument that was in Austin, inside the state capitol. Unfortunately, this was the state capitol that burned, and so you don't see it anymore because this is the only image of it, which was out of the book by Edward King, The Great South, published in 1874. But you can see that it has an obelisk, it has some cannonballs, there's crossed bones and a skull here, so it's very mortuary. But there's also a wreath, which I guess is sort of the wreath of victory, although a Pyrrhic victory, as we all know. But a lot of the symbolism that you see here, it has clasped hands right there, and you often see farewell handshakes on gravestones. And you can see these in a lot of older colonial stones in the eastern U.S., not so much here in Texas. But it was interesting that this was what was come up with for a monument to the Alamo in 1841. And I've been digging around and looking through all sorts of things, city directories and Sanborn maps and bird's eye views. And it's interesting to see where the pioneer marble men came from, because obviously you don't get ones who were born in Texas until Adolf Hinman and his brother Carl were both born to German parents in New Braunfels in the 1850s and 60s. But check it out, in Austin, there's one from Scotland, one from New York, and one from Ohio. Rob was very early, he's like the 1850s, then these guys are after the Civil War. Colonel Martin Mann in Brenham was from Germany, Samuel Hanway in Dallas from Ohio. John Bergen, who's the Fort Worth early stonemaker, was from Ireland. His son, Edward, was born while he was in his father, John, was working in Talladega, Alabama. So that's interesting. Galveston, William Emmett was from England. Alexander Allen was from Massachusetts. And in fact, Loyal Allen is the son of Alexander Allen. T.E. Byrnes in Houston was from Ireland. So you get a lot of Irish, Scottish, English people coming and doing the stone carving. A couple of Texans, and then in San Antonio, Anton Altman and Frank Teich, both from Germany. Joseph Gooch in Waco was from Kentucky. So these are the places that the stone carvers were coming from. And so I've just been, William Emmett has been a mystery to me for a very long time, because this is in the First Street Cemetery in Waco, right by the Texas Ranger Hall of Fame. And the monument that it's on the right here is for Dr. Bayless Wood Earl. If you've ever been to the Earl Harrison House, the historic house in Waco from 1859, he built that and then up and died. So basically, it was his wife who ended up doing more of the living of it. But this is signed right down here, Emmett and Company, Galveston. I could not find Emmett and Company in any city directories for Galveston. No one that I asked who studied Galveston history had ever heard of William Emmett. And it wasn't until I actually got online earlier this year and went to the portal for Texas history and typed in Emmett and Company in quotation marks and found a newspaper from circa 1860 that was an ad for Emmett and Company, and that gave his first name, and so that sort of opened. It turned out that he was from England, had worked in I think it was Liverpool, came to the U.S. and worked in upstate New York. He came in the late 1850s to Galveston and was making stones. This is a pretty grand example of it. I think there's another one. Yes, this is Emmett and Company. This is in West Columbia at the Columbia Cemetery. And Martha Dance was a young woman, died in 1858. So he was doing pretty good business. There was but then the Civil War broke out, and he was, absolutely not invested in anything to do with the Civil War. He got the heck out. He moved to Indiana and lived the rest of his life in Indiana. But it turns out that there's one of those Victorian biographical gazettes from the 1890s that has his story in it, and so that's where I was able to find out about his brief time period in Galveston, late 50s, but got out, I guess in early 1861, something like that. Another early marble man was T.E. Byrnes, Thomas E. Byrnes, Houston Marble Works. This is from the bird's eye view of 1873. 35 is Houston Marble Works, and you can actually see the little gravestones out on display in the front yard there, which is very interesting because in a traditional craft relationship, basically who the person is who might be a farmer but who also carves gravestones, and you go to old Joe and you say, "Hi, my husband died. I need you to carve a gravestone." But this is a different mentality with T.E. Byrnes that you can come and shop. It's not just a bespoken for thing. I like that one. Can you carve the name on it? Or I want one like this, but is it cheaper if it's a foot smaller or something like that? So you can negotiate still. It's still being made in this spot, but something is changing from the traditional craft relationship. And here's T.E. Byrnes. Oops, Byrnes misspelled there. This is the Sanborn Fire Insurance map from August of 1855. This is actually, I believe, a slightly different location, but still in downtown Houston. And interestingly enough, you can see that the marble sales room is in a former church. That's kind of a strange and, I guess in some weird way, appropriate thing. And so the sales room is basically what others would call the ware room. That's where you showed off your wares. So he's moved from having to display outside. Maybe people complained, why do you have to walk down the street and see all these gravestones standing? But this is Houston, of course, which doesn't believe in zoning. So, he's probably the earliest Houstonian to really get going on that. But you can see that the marble room's there. The marble shop is where the carving is actually going to be done. And then attached to the marble shop, DWG is for dwelling. And so presumably this was Thomas E. Byrnes' house. And can you make out what that says there? Sleeping room. You need one of those in Houston. Which is to say that might be like a screened-in room or something like that in miserable, hot, humid climate like Houston. So that's interesting, the sleeping room. How do you like that? And here are two examples of Houston Marble Works, T.E. Byrnes works. This is the Baker Monument from the 1850s with this beautiful angel carved on it. It's actually for 3 children of the Baker family. And this is in Glenwood Cemetery, which is a gorgeous old cemetery in Houston. And this was for Annalisa Jones, who died in 1861. And it's in the Columbia Cemetery in West Columbia. As you can see, it's seen better times here. But it's actually signed right there, T.E. Byrnes, Houston. And basically a flat slab, a marble slab, which was one popular option early on in the production of commercially made stones. Another Galveston guy was Alexander Allen. He's the one from Massachusetts, and then worked in New York where his son was born. Here's his advertisement from the Galveston City Directory, which is pretty cool. It's wholesale and retail dealers in Italian and American marble. This is 1882, 83. So they're engaged in bringing the materials in. And so, you know, they'll carve it for you, or I guess you could buy it as a blank slab if you want. But headstones, stonework, but also iron railings. Remember that fence that we saw? This is when you're starting to get iron railings made because cast iron is becoming available through shops. And this is actually the Allen and Company Marble Yard in downtown Galveston. This is obviously no longer here. Very conveniently located next to the saloon. So here's the marble yard. The stone cutting is actually set back from the street, so you can display your marble right there. And then here's marble cutting. Then the office is right up front. And if they didn't have indoor plumbing, but if they did, they could go to the plumber right there. In Austin, R.B. Underhill was the proprietor of Austin Marble Works. This, again, promises foreign and domestic marble, the most complete stock and best facilities in the state. Monuments, headstones, tablets, urns, vases, statues, vaults, and all kinds of cemetery work. Have the latest and most improved machinery for polishing granite. And that's sort of the big new thing right here, is that you need, you know, a pretty high-tech machine, steam-driven, to get that. And this is the Sanborn Insurance Map, 1894, which was just northwest of the Capitol. This is Colorado right here, and here's 14th Street, so 13th is over here, so the Capitol is over here. And this was kind of a critical strategic advantage because they had laid a railroad line right up to the site of the Capitol because they needed to get all the red granite that was being quarried out in Burnett County. So there's this direct line from Austin to Burnett. And so for R.B. Underhill, that's a pretty critical advantage that he can use that to get his materials delivered practically to the door of his marble yard. The other thing, of course, is that he can ship out products, and you can find R.B. Underhill in a pretty wide variety, maybe a 100-mile radius of Austin. Interestingly enough, the yard and office has moved here to East 16th Street, corner of Navasota, which is the west entrance to the city cemetery. So I guess this is actually about where Dishfalk Field, the baseball field for UT is. And so that's the other logical place, is to be by the cemetery in terms of, you know, where the product is ultimately going to be delivered for people living in Austin. I have a feeling that they were moving the railroad line, so that advantage was disappearing. And here's an example of R.B. Underhill. This is in the private family plot of Colonel Sterling C. Robertson and Mrs. Robertson, and it's at the Robertson Ranch in Salado, which you can see as don't look too long, but while you're hurtling down I-35, it's on the west side, and you're taking your life in your hands if you do that. But you can see a grove of trees and the house, and it slopes down to Salado Creek, and so actually Salado Creek is sort of on the other side of the trees in the back here. But you know, a very important one of the impresarios of Texas, along with Stephen F. Austin, and so he gets this rather grandiose statue indicating his wealth and significance to Texas. And here's the detailing here of giving the data here, 1820 to 1879, so only lived to 59. And then Mrs. Robertson, they were both born in Tennessee. And she outlived him just by a little bit, died in Salado, 1883. So Underhill you can find and in fact Underhill had a San Antonio branch as well. So you can find Underhill in San Antonio cemeteries as well as Austin cemeteries, and then farther afield. Here's a simpler obelisk. This is probably from right after the war, particularly the tall one here. This is in the Richter Cemetery, which is in between Round Top and Winedale, which is near Carmine, which is, never mind. It's out there, let's put it that way. And Samuel K. Lewis is now mainly famous because his house was preserved by Miss Ima Hogg. It's part of the Winedale Historical Center and a fascinating house. So this is Sam Lewis, and this is his wife, Marshall Ann. That is not a typo. That is actually her name. Don't ask me. But both of them are under white marble obelisks, so very neoclassical. He predeceased her for about a decade. I forget exactly when she died, maybe the late 70s. But he actually has I believe that's a weeping willow, which is pretty typical funerary ornamentation, but it also has a Masonic symbol on it. Although I was showing this in class, and actually a detail, which I don't think I have here. And as fate would have it, one of my students was a Mason, and he said they have the Masonic symbol upside down. So, so that's kind of a cartographical error, I guess. And Marshall Ann actually has a hand in hers pointing up to heaven. She's gone to heaven, gone home. Wow, that sure looks rural, and things are changing pretty rapidly in northern Fayette County. Hey, I did have the, so you can see both the weeping willow, which was tremendously popular in New England, in the eastern states in general, 1790s, early 1800s. And here is the Masonic symbol. It has the G, right? So, I mean, it's not completely awful. Another local guy that I've just found out some more about is Martin W. Mann, who was from Germany. And this is actually signed. This is in the Frels. It doesn't say that, does it? Take my word for it. This is in the Frelsberg Lutheran Cemetery, which is right by the church. And Adolf Rohde, who died in 1867. M.W. Mann, I just found out this week, was born in Germany in 1830, came as an 18-year-old to New York, worked and lived in New York and worked on canals, and maybe that's the Erie Canal, I don't know, and ended up moving to Illinois. Fought in the Civil War quite enthusiastically on the northern side, but then ends up moving first to St. Louis after the war, and then to Brenham, Texas. I don't know what possessed him to move to Brenham, Texas, at a point when, people who fought for the North weren't particularly popular, but he was actually in a Grand Army of the Republic chapter, which is sort of the opposite side of Sons of Confederate Veterans. He lived in Brenham for about 10 years and then retired to Dallas, of all places. And I don't know why he moved to Dallas. So there's more that I'd like to find out about this particular guy. And then there's the Fort Worth Marble Works. And that's John A. Bergen and son, Edward. And here's that detail that shows the marble yard, which was actually at Rusk and so this is, and here's the older courthouse. And this is the bird's eye view of 1886. And if you look real closely, here's this house, which is this, and then there are the sample gravestones right out there on the lawn, which is kind of interesting because, here's the courthouse, and this is the jail. So I don't know if this is encouraging people to think about what might happen to them if they break the law, or what's going on here. But so Bergen and Son were actually working here at least by I think they show up in the 1880 census, but he had been in Alabama before that, but John Bergen was from Ireland originally. And here is a stone signed by Bergen and Son that's just across the river in Oakwood. The stone of Stella Evans, died when she was just an infant. Very beautifully carved stone. So it gives you a sense of the sort of thing. And this, sometimes if there's not a gravestone carver in the area yet, it might be 10 years after the death that a good one gets put up. But I think it's reasonable to say that this is pretty closely associated with the time of her death. This might have been Bergen's first major commission in Fort Worth, and really wanted to impress people by doing some beautiful and reasonably priced work. And so that's one of the noteworthy ones. And you can see that it is actually bounded as well by an old cast iron fence too, which is pretty awesome. One other, W.R. Simpson in Waco. Very similar kind of ad. Italian and American marble, monuments, headstones, vases, urns, and iron railings. This is in 1876. And here's an example of his work, which is, I think we might call this a high Victorian one. No more of those obelisks that tend to be looking back to ancient Egypt or something like that. This one is practically crawling with floral decoration and, you know, I don't know if that's nature red in tooth and claw or what. But Belle Jones was the wife of Travis Jones. He gets almost as big a headline as she does. But down here it's carved, "She made home pleasant." So that's how Belle is remembered. Well, and so this is white marble, which, you know, had to be imported to Texas, so that part of this upgrade in people's gravestones, you had to actually bring the material in. So that starts with marble. So you've got the network of bringing the stones, and that gets ramped up with gray granite as well. Although it was also possible, and here's another nice marble one, and this is by Wells and Gooch of Waco. And Joseph Wells was from Kentucky. He was on our list of monument men. And also in Waco, this is for William Barry Trice, who was a pretty prominent Wacoan, as you can see here. This is an early example of a stone that was made of Texas red granite. And those, you know, there were quarries in near Fredericksburg, near Llano, near Byrnes, that whole area out there. And that's the stone that the Texas State Capitol was made of. So quarries were being opened anyway. So basically, the marble men were hopping on that trend and sort of piggybacking on the infrastructure that was being created by using it for the state capitol. In San Antonio, a German immigrant by the name of Frank Teich was a pretty important figure too. This is his business card. No date, but I think this probably dates to the early 20th century. He was later moved to Llano and was working in Llano and Byrnes, but this is from his San Antonio period, and this is a Sanborn map from 1892 showing Frank Teich's marble works, which was very conveniently right by a railroad tie where it's crossing over the San Antonio River. This is at the southern part of the King William district, very near the Pioneer Mills, the Pioneer Flour Mills, and they needed a tie-in as well. So, you know, it sort of is becoming industrial areas where multiple companies can benefit from the railroad connection. So Teich, now it's granite and marble works, just not a marble works. Monuments and statuary, iron fences, floor tiling, etc., all sawing and polishing done by steam, which is another little bit of evidence of the technology here. And so it's at South Alamo and Aransas. You can very conveniently take the South Alamo streetcar line, so you can go shopping for gravestone. And here's an early Teich. This is actually marble period, but it's signed right down here, F. Teich, San Antonio. But this is in Fredericksburg. It's the stone of Christian Ox. And he died in 1887. And it has the Holy Bible as sort of its main motif here. So this is one of the first out-of-town stones to be put up in Fredericksburg. And that, interestingly enough, it seems like Frank Teich wanted to have a business arrangement with the new marble works that was opening in Fredericksburg, the Noggle brothers. And because this is still owned by the descendant, it's owned by Don Noggle, who still sells gravestones. He doesn't make them anymore, but he sells them in Fredericksburg in the same building that his grandfather, no, must be great-grandfather, did. But after Frank Teich left, they flipped over his card, and Willie, who was the artist of the four brothers, draws this picture of a horse or a mule that's being tied up to a monument, and it says, "Every monument put up, guaranteed not to fall down within 10 days." So I think they were a little skeptical about the longevity of some of Frank Teich's works. And here's the sort of red granite that you would get in the Fredericksburg. This is in der Stadtfriedhof. The town cemetery, Friedhof, the yard of peace or garden of peace. Beautifully carved. It's a very hard surface. It's difficult to carve on. but the results can be quite fine. And in terms of that, here's the Oregon family monument, which has memory is possession on it in Bastrop. I'm going to finish up with just a few images of Germans. So let's just, do I have about 5 more minutes? Is that where we're at? Or? Okay. A late Southern folk expression, concrete markers, basically create a concrete in form and then just take a stylus or a twig or something, and Mullisy and Lauderdale. And here's one of the other elements of change, the cast iron fence that you see right here. And this is, a lot of these are signed on the gate. And this one is from the Rogers Iron Company of Springfield, Ohio. And it specifically has a patent date of 1861. They probably didn't send many to Texas in the next couple of years since there was a little war going on. But after the war, with railroad ties, railroad connections coming in, then these products from Midwestern factories tend to ramp up. Interestingly enough, with Mexican American, there's kind of their own version of the cast iron fence, which tends to be the picket fence. This is from the painting by Theodore Gentil of Mission San Jose, and you can see the little cerquita fences out front. And the fences are gone now, but there are still a couple of burials, one for the Huizar family, which is right in front of Mission San Jose. And you can see cerquitas of a more industrial nature here. This is one out in Corrales, New Mexico, just north of Albuquerque. And some of the elaborate decoration of Hispanic graves that you can find in rural cemeteries like the Moorville Cemetery in Falls County, just off of I-35. But in German Texan graveyards, you can get gates, which is not surprisingly different than the gates in an Anglo cemetery. But the earlier traditional ones were more like the Moisebach one with its drywall stone rock fence around it. And then one in Round Top that we saw already. This is another beautiful fence for the Evangelical Lutheran Zion's Cemetery, which was associated with the Evangelical Lutheran Church. And even in Czech areas, you get the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary Church Cemetery in Praha, which is near Schulenburg and Shiner in that area. This is illustrated in Terry Jordan as probably one of the most beautiful stones ever made in Texas. And I thank God that Terry Jordan published this photo, because it is this beautiful Gothic revival. It's got this curving sides that come to a point here, sort of a rose window there, and a trefoil here. And here lies Johann Justus Kellner, who died in 1851. And so it's the oldest date on a gravestone in the cemetery. And so Terry Jordan mentions all that. But he doesn't notice that down here,
Dr. Ken Hafertepe. He specializes in decorative arts, in material culture, historic preservation, architecture, and he is currently the chair of the Museum Studies Department at Baylor, where he's been since the year 2000. He has got several publications. Here are just a few: A History of Ashton Villa in Galveston, and A History of Abner Cook, Master Builder on the Texas Frontier. Most recently, hot off the presses, is an article that today's talk is based on, about wandering in Texas cemeteries. So we have a few copies of these at the end if you might be interested. So with that, I will give you Ken Hafertepe and a wander through a Texas cemetery.
Thank you, Leanna. Good to see you all here. All right. Well, yes, as Leanna was mentioning, that when the Texas State Historical Association was here in Fort Worth, over at the Renaissance Hotel, about 2 blocks from here, there was a session, there always is, of young Texas historians, college-age students who've done publication-worthy research. And they always ask a senior Texas history scholar to do a presentation as well. And I guess I've acquired enough gray hairs over the year that I now qualify for senior historian status if sheerly in terms of gray hairs, rather than anything else. But the talk that I did for that was Wanderings in Texas Cemeteries and what we might learn from them. And Texas cemeteries are something that I've been wandering through and wondering about for a very long time now. When I teach American material culture, which is really what can stuff tell us about history and sort of the big historical picture, we always take a field trip to Oakwood. Not the Oakwood here in Fort Worth, but the Oakwood in Waco is a pretty popular name for cemeteries. In fact, there's one in Austin as well. And a lot of cemeteries have either oak in the name or wood, or it seems to be an association with evergreen trees and the idea of eternal life, which is one of those interesting things that addresses the issues of the way in which cemeteries are about people mourning the loss of a loved one, but also thinking about issues of eternal life. And when I teach gravestones and graveyards in material culture, we always use the classic book on the subject, which is Terry G. Jordan's Texas Graveyards. Anybody seen that one? It's getting to be an oldie moldy now. And in fact, I'm getting a little bit impatient with it. In the next year or so, I'm going to publish a book on the material culture of German Texans, which is going to have a very long chapter about cemeteries in Fredericksburg and New Braunfels, but also in Round Top and Frelsburg, and even Germans making gravestones in San Antonio and Houston and the like. We'll see little foretastes of that this morning. Well, we're just going to give you the very quickest overview of Terry Jordan's 4 noteworthy truths about Texas graveyards. They are a form of necrogeography. They are about the living and the dead. They reflect conservatism and they reflect change. Okay, so those are Terry Jordan's 4 big truths. Necrogeography sounds like a pretty fancy concept, but basically it's saying, and Terry Jordan was a cultural geographer at University of North Texas for a very long time. Actually, he was at North Texas State. That's another story. And then later at the University of Texas. And so he was interested in human behavior, human settlement, and the way that the remains that humans leave on the landscape are in fact telling us something about the culture that they came from. For example, an excellent example of burial practices varying by region and by ethnic groups that settle in a particular region is the use of dry rock walls to bound cemeteries. This is in Round Top, Texas, right by the Bethlehem Lutheran Church, one of the oldest and most historic churches in Texas, 1866. And just the way that these walls are constructed are speaking to certain German attitudes, and you'll find these in other German cemeteries, like the Moisebach Cemetery out in Cherry Spring near Fredericksburg, but you're not going to find those in a Norwegian cemetery or a Mexican cemetery or an Anglo cemetery. So necrogeography is saying that the way people behave and create spaces that are about burial tell you something about the ethnic group that they came from. This is especially true in earlier years, and one of the things that I'm trying to do with Germans is to take the story from early Germanic ideas, or ideas that Germans adopted in Texas, in this case, and following the story through and watching Germans assimilate rather slowly into the American mainstream. So that's something that I'm very interested in. So necrogeography. Cemeteries are about the living and the dead. This rather, I don't know if it's a heroic or a desperate statement that memory is possession, carved, at great expense I might add, into a granite stone in the cemetery in Bastrop. And this was for the Organ family. Frank Organ was the son, and his parents were Ed and Sarah Jane Organ. And this seems to be one of those cases where the monument is perhaps even more for the living, because it's Ed and Sarah Jane working out their grieving towards the early death of their son. And so that to remember their son is to still somehow possess him even though he's gone. And much more typical are phrasings like gone but not forgotten. You can see that in just about any cemetery in Texas. And I guess this is sort of the individualistic school teacher, Sarah Jane, wanting to state that in a slightly more emphatic way. So cemeteries are definitely for burying the dead, but they're also for the mourning that we do for the dead and the memorialization of the dead. And cemeteries are about conservatism, and that's sort of speaking to the very traditional aspects, especially of early cemeteries and handmade gravestones, and that sometimes the symbolism in here is incredibly ancient, sometimes even predating Christianity, although here we have a dove bringing an olive branch, which seems to be alluding to Genesis and the story of Noah and the great flood. This one is actually just a couple of miles from here. This is over in the Lonesome Dove Cemetery in Grapevine. We'll talk about that more in just a minute, but a very cool gravestone. I keep pointing towards the screen, but I'm supposed to be pointing back there. I'll remember that. And then finally, what you observe looking